Why did God seal the ark from the outside, not Noah? Enoch's forgotten testimony reveals a danger far worse than water, something the flood was never meant to stop, but only contain. Genesis tells us the door of the ark was shut, but it never tells us who shut it. Read the verse again, slowly, and you will notice something most preachers skip right past. And the Lord shut him in. Not Noah, not his sons, the Lord himself. Genesis 7:16 records it plainly, and yet for centuries this detail has been treated as a footnote instead of what it actually is, a warning written into Scripture on purpose. Think about that for a moment. Noah spent over 100 years building that vessel. He gathered the animals, sealed the wood with pitch, prepared food for his family. Every practical task fell to him. So why, at the final moment, does God step in and do the one thing Noah was fully capable of doing himself? Why does the text go out of its way to remove human hands from that final act? Because the danger outside was never only water. We tend to picture the flood as a natural disaster. Rain, rising rivers, a world drowning under weather. But the Book of Enoch, a text known to the earliest Hebrew communities and quoted directly in the New Testament book of Jude, tells a very different story about what was happening on the earth before that door was sealed. It speaks of watchers, heavenly beings who left their assigned position, who came down and took wives among the daughters of men, and who fathered offspring unlike anything the earth had produced before them. Genesis 6:4 gives us the shortest, strangest verse in the whole flood narrative. There were giants in the earth in those days. No explanation, no elaboration, just a statement dropped into the text like a warning label, as if the writer expected the reader to already understand the horror behind it. Enoch does not leave it there. Enoch names them. The Nephilim, born from a union Scripture itself calls forbidden, described as consuming everything around them, turning on animals, turning on each other, and eventually turning their hunger toward humanity itself. This is the world Noah was building his ark inside of. Not a world of rain clouds and thunder, a world where the created order had been broken from the inside, where something walked the earth that was never meant to exist in the first place. Enoch describes these watchers as 200 in number, led by a figure named Semjaza, who bound themselves together with an oath before they descended, fully aware that what they were about to do could not be undone. That detail matters. This was not an accident of weakness. It was a deliberate crossing of a boundary God had set in place since the beginning, a line separating heaven from earth that these beings chose to erase on purpose. And once that line was gone, everything that followed spread faster than anyone could contain. The offspring born from that union were not simply tall men. Ancient sources describe them growing in size and appetite far beyond what the land could sustain, until the food of humanity was no longer enough to satisfy them. That is when Scripture tells us they turned on the animals, then on one another, and finally on the people who had once been their neighbors. An entire world eaten alive from within, not by outsiders, but by something born out of humanity's own bloodline gone wrong. And this is where that single detail in Genesis 7:16 stops being a footnote and becomes the center of the entire story. If the threat outside the ark was only water, Noah could seal that door himself. Water does not reason. Water does not deceive. But if what remained outside included beings capable of persuasion, capable of appearing righteous, capable of speaking the very language of faith back to a righteous man standing at the entrance of his own salvation, then no human hand could be trusted with that door, not even Noah's. Jude 1:6 confirms these were not simple stories meant to frighten children around a fire. It tells us plainly that angels who did not keep their proper domain, who left their own habitation, were reserved by God in chains under darkness, held for judgment. That is not folklore, that is doctrine sitting quietly inside your own Bible, waiting for someone to actually read it instead of skimming past it. Ask yourself honestly, why would Scripture bother preserving a detail about who closed a door unless that detail carried weight far beyond carpentry? The ark was never just a boat surviving a storm. It was a sealed sanctuary, protected against a corruption that had already proven it could reach almost anyone except Noah. Genesis makes a point of saying Noah was perfect in his generations, a phrase many scholars connect not only to his righteousness before God, but to his bloodline itself. untouched by what had spread across the rest of humanity. In a world where purity had become the exception rather than the rule, one family remained whole enough to carry the future forward. And still, God did not leave that door to chance. He sealed it himself. There is something worth sitting with here. If the God of the universe considered that door too important to leave in human hands, what does that tell you about what was still moving in the darkness outside? What does it tell you about how close corruption had come, even to the doorstep of the one family chosen to survive it? This is the story the traditional flood narrative leaves out. Not because it isn't true, but because it makes people uncomfortable. It suggests our world was once shared with something else, something that should never have crossed the line it crossed, and that Scripture remembers this far more clearly than most of us were ever taught. If this kind of forgotten truth stirs something in you, the kind of truth that was hiding in plain sight the whole time, you need to see what else Enoch recorded. Our premium illustrated biblical mystery guide, the Forbidden Book of Enoch, walks you through exactly what happened to the Watchers, how the Nephilim rose and fell, and what the world before the flood actually looked like before judgment came down on it. It is laid out with full illustrations that bring these ancient events to life in a way Scripture alone often cannot. You will find the link waiting for you in the very first comment pinned right below this video. If you have ever felt that the Bible was holding back a deeper layer of truth, this guide was built for you. And if you want to keep walking through mysteries like this one, subscribe to the channel now, because what Enoch reveals next about the corruption that spread before the flood goes far deeper than most people are ready to hear. Most people assume Noah was chosen because he was a good man in a bad crowd. That reading is comfortable. It is also incomplete. Scripture describes something far more specific than general goodness, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Genesis 6:9 uses a phrase easy to rush past. Noah was perfect in his generations, not simply righteous in his choices, but perfect in his lineage, his bloodline, his genealogy. Hebrew scholars have long noted that the word used here, tamim, carries a meaning closer to whole or unblemished than it does to morally flawless. It is the same word later used to describe animals fit for sacrifice, animals without defect. Applied to a man's generations, it points to something beyond behavior. It points to ancestry. Why would the text specify his bloodline unless bloodline itself had become a category of concern? By the time Noah appears in Genesis, corruption had not remained an abstract spiritual idea. Genesis 6:12 states it directly. God looked upon the earth, and it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth. All flesh. Not merely all hearts, all minds, all choices. Flesh. A word describing the physical body itself. This is where Enoch's record becomes difficult to ignore, because it explains exactly how flesh itself came to be described as corrupted. The Watchers did not simply influence humanity from a distance. They intermarried with human women, producing offspring whose very biology carried something outside the created order God had spoken into existence in the beginning. Once that boundary was crossed, the corruption was no longer only spiritual. It had become hereditary, spreading through families and generations the same way any trait passes from parent to child. Against that backdrop, Noah's bloodline being called whole is not a small detail buried in a genealogy list. It is the entire reason he was chosen. Out of every family on earth, his was the one lineage where that corruption had not yet taken root. Not because he was the only kind man alive, though Scripture certainly affirms his righteousness as well, but because his family represented something the rest of the earth had already lost, a continuation of humanity as it was originally created to be. This reframes the flood itself. It was never simply a punishment for bad behavior, in the way we usually picture judgment, sinners against saints, wickedness against virtue. It was a rescue of the created order itself, a removal of a corruption that had spread so thoroughly it threatened to erase what it meant to be human altogether. Job 1:6 and 2:1 describe the sons of God, the same term Genesis uses for the beings who married human women in chapter 6, presenting themselves before the Lord. These were not distant angels with no connection to the earth. They were beings capable of crossing into the physical realm, capable of producing physical offspring, capable of altering the very fabric of what humanity was. And this is precisely why the door of the ark could not be trusted to human hands, even Noah's. If the corruption had already proven capable of entering families that once seemed secure, if it had already spread across nearly the entire earth in the span of a handful of generations, then the moment of final protection required something beyond human judgment. It required the direct intervention of the one being who could see clearly enough to know exactly what still remained outside that door, waiting, watching, capable of persuasion in ways no human eye could detect. Consider the timeline for a moment. Enoch himself, the man the entire book bears its name from, lived generations before the flood, and yet was shown these events in vision, warned of what was coming, told to record it so that it would not be lost. Genesis 5:24 tells us Enoch walked with God, and then he was not, for God took him. He did not die in the ordinary sense. He was removed from the earth entirely, taken before the judgment came, as though even his presence needed to be preserved, apart from what was about to unfold below. Why would a man be taken out of the world specifically to preserve a record of angels crossing into forbidden territory, unless that record was meant to survive long after the flood erased almost everything else? Enoch was not writing folklore for entertainment. He was documenting a threat, one specific enough, real enough, that heaven itself considered it worth preserving through supernatural means rather than trusting it to memory alone. His writings describe being taken through the heavens themselves, shown the chambers where the watchers were already being held after their initial judgment, hearing their pleas for mercy and being sent back to deliver an answer they did not want to hear. There would be no pardon. The corruption they unleashed on the earth had already gone too far to be undone by an apology. That refusal is worth sitting with. Even beings who once stood in the presence of God, who once held a position of honor before they abandoned it, could not talk their way back once flesh itself had been altered by their choice. If mercy was withheld from them, it tells you something about how seriously heaven regarded what had been done to the human bloodline they left behind. The Book of Jubilees, another ancient text closely tied to this same period, adds a detail worth noting here as well. It describes the earth as filled with violence, not simply because people chose cruelty, but because the offspring of the watchers required more than the land could give them. Their hunger outpaced the harvest. When the fields could no longer feed them, they turned to consuming what walked beside them, and eventually what walked in front of them. This was not metaphorical violence. It was the direct physical result of something existing on the earth that was never meant to be there in the first place. By the time we reach the sealed door of the ark, we are not looking at a simple weather event. We are looking at the final act in a much longer war, one that began the moment the watchers first descended, one that spread through bloodlines rather than borders, and one that required a creator, not a carpenter, to close the final barrier between what remained pure and what had already been lost. That is the world Noah stepped into the ark from. That is the reason the hand that sealed the door could not afford to be his own. There is a question almost nobody asks about the flood story, and it is this: where did the giants go? Genesis 6:4 tells us they existed before the flood, and then the flood comes and the waters cover everything. And by the time we reach the other side of that story, in the book of Numbers, they are somehow still there. Numbers 13:33 records the spies sent into Canaan, describing giants in the land, the sons of Enoch, said to come from the Nephilim, the same name, the same word used centuries earlier to describe the offspring of the Watchers. If the flood was meant to wipe them out entirely, how does that name resurface generations later, attached to living men still walking the earth? The spies were not exaggerating for dramatic effect. 10 of the 12 men sent into Canaan came back terrified, describing themselves as grasshoppers in comparison to what they saw there. That is not the language of ordinary military opposition. Israel had already fought wars, faced armies, stood against kingdoms. This was different. Whatever they encountered in that land carried the same weight, the same unnatural scale, as the beings described generations earlier in Genesis, and the text does not shy away from drawing that direct connection for us. This is one of the most uncomfortable questions in the entire narrative, and Enoch's writings offer an answer most modern readers have never been told. According to Enoch, when the Watchers' offspring were destroyed in the flood, something remained. Not their physical bodies, but their spirits. Enoch describes these spirits as being unable to die the way flesh dies, because they were never fully human nor fully angelic to begin with. They were something in between, a category the created order had never accounted for. And when their bodies perished in the flood, their spirits had nowhere to go. They remained on the earth. Enoch calls them evil spirits, wandering, seeking bodies, seeking influence, seeking a way back into the physical world they had been torn from. If this sounds familiar, it should. The New Testament is filled with accounts of unclean spirits, demons that beg not to be sent into the abyss, spirits that seek out human hosts because being without a body causes them a kind of torment Scripture rarely explains in detail. Matthew 12:43 describes an unclean spirit walking through dry places, seeking rest and finding none. Why would a spirit need rest unless it once had a body and now desperately wants one again? Enoch's account gives that mystery a history. It suggests the demonic activity described throughout the Old and New Testaments is not simply generic evil in the abstract. It is the direct continuation of a corruption that began before the flood, survived the flood in spiritual form, and has been present in the world in one shape or another ever since. The flood did not end the war. It only removed the physical bodies from the battlefield. This changes how we should read the rest of the giants who appear after the flood. If the Nephilim were entirely wiped out physically, and yet their name reappears attached to real people encountered by Israel's spies, the most consistent explanation Scripture allows for is a second wave, either through a smaller-scale repetition of the same forbidden union or through bloodlines that survived the flood in ways the text does not fully explain but does not entirely rule out either. Deuteronomy 2:20 and 3:11 mention the Rephaim and King Og of Bashan described in such specific physical terms, down to the size of his bed, that the writer clearly expected readers to understand this was not folklore. This was recent memory, close enough to living generations that measurement still mattered. Consider what that means for the world Israel was walking into during the conquest of Canaan. This was not simply a war against rival nations. Joshua and the Israelites were being sent into land still touched by the same corruption that necessitated the flood in the first place, land inhabited by descendants or remnants of the very beings the flood was meant to remove. That reframes the entire conquest narrative. It was never only about territory. It carried the weight of finishing something that began generations earlier, something the flood had only partially resolved. Joshua 11:21 and 22 tell us that Joshua cut off the Anakim from the hill country, destroying them utterly with their cities, and yet the text specifically notes that some remained in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod. The writer did not need to include that detail. A simple account of victory would have been enough. But Scripture rarely wastes words, and this small note carries enormous weight. It tells us the corruption was not fully removed even after the conquest. It survived in pockets, in specific cities, waiting. And it is worth remembering that centuries later, a giant of Gath named Goliath would step onto a battlefield in Israel and challenge an entire army to single combat, standing over 9 feet tall by most traditional measurements. Descended from exactly the bloodline this verse refused to let us forget. This is also where Enoch's warning stretches beyond ancient history and into something far more unsettling to sit with. If these spirits never fully left the earth, if they have been present in one form or another ever since that first judgment, then the corruption Noah's family was sealed away from was never permanently defeated. It was contained, slowed, pushed back into the shadows, where Scripture consistently describes spiritual warfare continuing long after the floodwaters receded, long after Canaan was conquered, and honestly, according to passages like Ephesians 6:12, continuing still. Ephesians 6:12 tells believers plainly that the struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Paul was not inventing a new idea when he wrote that. He was describing the same battlefield Enoch had already mapped out centuries before, a battlefield that never actually closed when the ark's door was sealed. It simply moved. Think about how differently the entire narrative of Scripture reads once this is understood. Every account of demonic possession in the Gospels, every warning Paul gives about spiritual forces working against believers, every instruction about putting on the full armor of God, suddenly connects backward to a single moment on a mountainside before the flood, when a group of heavenly beings decided their assigned place was not enough for them. What began as a rebellion in one generation became a war stretching across every generation that followed, and the sealed door of the ark was never the ending of that war. It was simply the moment humanity's future was protected long enough to continue fighting it. If corruption could reach nearly every family on earth before the flood, and if Noah's own bloodline was the one exception preserved for that reason, a harder question begins to surface. How close did it actually come to reaching him too? Genesis never tells us this directly, and any honest teacher has to admit that. But Enoch's writings, along with fragments preserved in the Genesis Apocryphon found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, describe a moment that has puzzled readers for centuries. When Noah's son Lamech saw his newborn child, he did not simply celebrate, he grew afraid. The infant's appearance was unlike anything he expected, and Lamech went to his own father, Methuselah, asking whether this child might somehow be connected to the Watchers, whether the corruption spreading across the earth had somehow touched his own house. Methuselah, in turn, sought out Enoch himself, who by that point had already been taken into the heavens and given knowledge no other living man possessed. And Enoch's answer was reassurance. This child, Noah, was fully human, fully righteous, chosen specifically to carry humanity through what was coming. But notice what the question itself reveals. If a family already this close to God, already this deeply connected to Enoch's own line, could still wonder whether corruption had reached their own child, it tells you exactly how widespread and how convincing that corruption had become by that point in history. Consider the position this family occupied. Methuselah was Enoch's own son, living the longest recorded life in Scripture, a walking witness to nearly the entire span of pre-flood history. Lamech was his son, Noah's own father, a man who named his child Noah, specifically because he hoped this son would bring comfort concerning the toil and labor that had come from the ground under God's curse. This was not a family disconnected from spiritual reality. They understood exactly what was happening around them, and still that understanding was not enough to erase the fear that their own bloodline might have been touched by it. This is not folklore added for dramatic effect. This is the text preserving genuine fear, a family that had watched what was happening around them closely enough to doubt even their own bloodline. And if that doubt could reach a household this close to righteousness, imagine what had already happened to families with no such foundation to stand on. Enoch describes the spread of this corruption using language that goes far beyond simple disobedience. He describes the Watchers teaching humanity forbidden knowledge, not simply forbidden relationships. Azazel, one of the leaders among the fallen Watchers, is specifically named as the one who taught men how to forge weapons of war, how to craft instruments of metal for killing, and taught women the art of cosmetics and adornment used to seduce and manipulate. Other Watchers taught the secrets of enchantments, root cuttings, astrology, the reading of signs in the sun and moon and stars for purposes never intended by their creator. This detail matters more than it first appears. The corruption before the flood was never simply about bloodlines mixing. It was about knowledge being released into the world before humanity was prepared to handle it responsibly. Knowledge that led directly to violence, to vanity, to spiritual practices that pulled people's attention away from their creator and toward power, appearance, and control. Enoch records this knowledge spreading like a disease with no cure, passed from teacher to student, from watcher to willing human hands, eager to gain an advantage over their neighbors. Weapons meant humanity could now kill more efficiently than ever before. Cosmetics and adornment meant relationships built on manipulation rather than covenant. Astrology and divination meant trust shifted away from the God who created the stars and toward the stars themselves. Genesis 6.5 summarizes the result in a single devastating sentence. Every imagination of the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually, not occasionally evil, not evil in isolated incidents, continually. A society so thoroughly reshaped by forbidden knowledge that evil had become its default state, rather than an exception to be corrected. This is the environment Noah's family lived inside, while building a vessel most of their neighbors mocked them for constructing. Imagine standing outside that ark, watching your own family labor for over a century on something the rest of the world dismissed as madness, all while quietly wondering whether the darkness spreading everywhere else had somehow already touched your own children. That is not a comfortable story. It is a human one, and it is exactly the kind of detail Scripture rarely receives credit for preserving. It also reframes something easy to overlook about Noah's righteousness. He was not righteous because temptation never reached his household. He was righteous because he remained faithful, despite living directly inside the same corrupted world everyone else inhabited, surrounded by the same forbidden knowledge, the same violence, the same spiritual confusion Enoch describes spreading across the earth. His family's fear about Lamech's child proves they were not isolated from what was happening around them. They were fully aware of it, watching it unfold in real time, and still chose to remain faithful to the God who had not yet even told them a flood was coming. This is what makes the sealing of that door in Genesis 7:16 so significant when you finally understand the full weight behind it. God was not simply protecting a family from bad weather. He was protecting the last untouched continuation of humanity from a corruption so pervasive it had already caused a righteous family to doubt their own newborn son. If that fear could reach Lamech's household, the danger the ark's door needed to seal against was never abstract. It was close. It was real. And it required more than human strength or human trust to hold that final boundary in place. There is a reason this part of the story rarely gets taught from the pulpit on a typical Sunday morning. It complicates the simple version most people grew up with, the flannel graph image of animals walking in 2 by 2 while Noah smiles and waves. The real account is heavier than that, filled with fear, uncertainty, and a family clinging to faith, while surrounded by a world already lost to something they could not fully explain. But that heavier version is also the more honest one, and honestly, the more powerful one, because it shows a God who does not simply demand faith from a distance. He steps directly into the moment of greatest vulnerability and closes the door himself. There is one more layer to this story most people never reach, and it may be the most unsettling piece of all. Enoch does not describe the flood as the final resolution to what the Watchers started. He describes it as the beginning of a much longer containment. One Scripture suggests is still playing out even now. Peter, of all people, confirms this directly. 2 Peter 2:4 states that God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them down to hell, delivering them into chains of darkness, reserved for judgment. Notice the word reserved, not executed, not erased, reserved, held, waiting for a final judgment that has not yet arrived. If these beings were simply destroyed at the flood, there would be nothing left to reserve, no ongoing sentence to describe. The language itself tells us something was preserved, contained, and is still being held even now. It is worth noting that Peter wrote this to an early Christian audience, already living generations after the flood, generations after Enoch's writings had circulated widely enough that Jude felt comfortable quoting them directly in his own letter, as though referencing common, accepted knowledge. These were not obscure references buried in forgotten scrolls. They were part of the working knowledge of the earliest church, understood well enough that 2 separate New Testament writers could reference the same event with confidence their readers would recognize exactly what they meant. This connects directly back to what Enoch described happening to the spirits of the Nephilim once their physical bodies perished beneath the floodwaters that eventually swallowed the entire earth from the mountains down to the lowest valleys. Their bodies died, their spirits did not. And if Scripture describes an ongoing spiritual conflict continuing long after the flood, 1 Paul confirms in Ephesians when he describes wrestling against principalities and powers rather than flesh and blood, then the story the flood tells is not one of a threat eliminated. It is one of a threat interrupted, slowed, pushed back behind a boundary that has required maintaining ever since. This reframes something many people misunderstand about the rest of the Old Testament. The repeated warnings against sorcery, against divination, against consulting mediums and familiar spirits, found throughout Deuteronomy and Leviticus, were never simply cultural rules meant to separate Israel from neighboring nations for the sake of tradition. They were direct instructions for avoiding contact with exactly the kind of spiritual corruption Enoch describes originating with the Watchers in the first place. The same forbidden knowledge Azazel taught before the flood, the astrology, the enchantments, The reading of signs meant to bypass God and access hidden power directly resurfaces again and again throughout Israel's history precisely because the source of that knowledge was never fully removed from the world. It was only ever contained. Deuteronomy 18:10 and 11 list these practices with striking specificity, naming diviners, observers of times, enchanters, witches, charmers, consulters with familiar spirits, wizards and necromancers, all forbidden in the same breath. That is not a vague warning against generalized evil. It is a detailed catalogue, matching almost exactly the categories of forbidden teaching Enoch attributes to the Watchers centuries earlier. Preserved in a legal code Israel carried with them into the very land still occupied by the giants those same Watchers had fathered. Look at how consistently Scripture treats these practices as connected to something far older and far darker than simple superstition. King Saul's encounter with the Witch of Endor in 1 Samuel 28 is treated with genuine spiritual weight, not dismissed as trickery. Manasseh's later embrace of sorcery and divination in 2 Kings 21 is listed among the gravest sins recorded for any king of Judah, serious enough that Scripture attributes the eventual fall of Jerusalem partly to the corruption he allowed to spread during his reign. These are not isolated incidents scattered randomly through history. They are recurring contact points with the same corrupted knowledge system Enoch traces back to a specific rebellion on a specific mountain before the flood ever came. And this brings the story full circle, back to that single sealed door in Genesis 7:16, the one detail so many readers skim past without ever stopping to ask why it was written that way in the first place. If the corruption before the flood never fully ended, only shifted from physical bodies into spiritual influence, then the sealing of that ark was never simply about surviving one catastrophic event. It was about preserving a bloodline, a foundation, a starting point pure enough that humanity could continue existing in a world where this ongoing spiritual battle would still need to be fought, generation after generation, without that foundation ever collapsing entirely again. This is why Enoch's testimony carries weight far beyond ancient curiosity. It is not simply a record of strange events from thousands of years ago. It is a framework explaining why the New Testament writers speak so seriously about spiritual warfare, why demonic activity appears so consistently throughout the Gospels, and why Paul felt it necessary to remind believers that their struggle was never against people, but against forces set in motion long before any of them were born. The war Enoch describes beginning before the flood is the same war Scripture describes continuing into the earliest church, and honestly, the same war many believers sense pressing against their own lives even now, without always having language to explain why it feels so ancient, so persistent, so far beyond ordinary human conflict. Genesis 7:16 is not the end of this story. It is the moment a boundary was drawn, a boundary God himself had to seal, because no human hand could be trusted to hold it against what remained outside. Understanding what that boundary was, actually protecting against changes how you read everything that follows, from Canaan's giants to Saul's desperation at Endor to Paul's warning about principalities in high places. It is all one continuous account, and Enoch is the thread connecting every piece of it together. Once you see that thread, you cannot read the flood narrative the same way again. The ark stops being a children's story about animals and rainbows and becomes what it always actually was. A rescue mission carried out in the middle of a war that started before the water ever rose and never fully ended once it receded. Every generation since has inherited a piece of that same conflict, whether they realized it or not, and Enoch's testimony remains one of the clearest windows we have into how it all began and why it still matters to anyone paying close enough attention today. The door was sealed by hands you cannot see, for reasons most people never think to ask about. Now you know why. If Enoch's testimony stirred something in you today, our premium illustrated biblical mystery guide, The Forbidden Book of Enoch, goes even deeper into the Watchers, the Nephilim, and the world before the flood. Fully illustrated and waiting for you in the first comment pinned below. Thank you for spending this time with us today. If this changed how you see the flood story, hit subscribe, leave a comment telling us what stood out most, and give this video a like so more truth seekers like you can find it. Stay close, because the next video appearing on your screen carries the story forward, and you will not want to miss what comes next.